Okay, so far we have just made very general and simple assumptions and descriptions about the shapes of supply and demand curves. We've said that demand slopes downward, that supply slopes upward, and that's really about it. We haven't talked about their intercepts or their slope. If you remember graphing from high school algebra, then that's really what we're talking about here, that they are lines or they're curves, and as curves we can represent that information with an equation. And so we are going to do that a little bit further down the road, but what I would like to do in this video is at least introduce you to the concept of elasticity, which is going to measure not necessarily just the slope of the curves, but it's going to give us an idea about what the curves look like and how they relate information about one of the variables being price to the other variable, which is quantity. We're going to see why it's important and how we see it in graphs. So as elasticity is going to tell us about how one variable is related to another, how quantity is related to price, then in the professional world, in your careers, it's going to be important to understand elasticity so that you can predict how the quantity demanded or supplied of a good will change in response to price changes. That it's going to be relatively easy, as we will see in a couple of videos, to predict the direction of the change. That if there's a pandemic, then there's going to be a greater demand for cleaning goods and services and hygienics and Clorox wipes and Purell hand sanitizer, and there's going to be less of a demand for sporting events, for example. So it's going to be relatively easy to make those sorts of predictions. It's going to be a little bit harder to quantify them, to put a number on how much the equilibrium quantity or equilibrium price is going to change. And so if we really want to quantify that, then we're going to need some measure of responsiveness of how price is related to the quantity, and we're going to get that information from measuring elasticity. So when we think about whether or not we can make the world a better place and the importance of understanding elasticity with that question, it's important to understand this concept so that you can know who will carry the burden or receive the benefit of a price change. That, as we'll see next week, oftentimes who we place a tax on isn't who actually pays for the tax. That even though we may think that consumers pay 20 cents per gallon when they go to the gas station, the producers may be paying more of that than we think, or consumers may be paying more of it. They may be paying all of it. And so to understand who really is paying for a particular price change, we need to understand elasticity. And this is kind of a give me here, but you're going to be expected to calculate elasticity next week. And to prepare you for that, we at least need to understand what it is and be familiar with the general principles of elasticity. So as alluded to on the previous slide, elasticity just means responsiveness. It's not going to be any more complicated or sophisticated than that, that when you hear the word elasticity, you want to think how one variable responds to a change in another variable. And so the relationship between any two variables is then going to have an elasticity. There is an elasticity of housing supply to the price of housing. There's an elasticity to the demand of avocados to the price of avocados. And so the most common types of elasticity are going to be the own price elasticity of demand, how the quantity demanded changes in response to a change in the price, the own price elasticity of supply, how the quantity supplied of a good changes in response to the price of that good, a cross price elasticity of demand, representing how the quantity demanded of one good changes in response to the price of another good. And we really won't look at that too much in this class That's more of a Econ 305 intermediate micro theory calculation, though it's not especially complicated. You could think about the demand for peanut butter being related to the price of jelly, and that if the price of jelly goes through the roof, if there's a massive jelly shortage, then people may consume less peanut butter since they're going to be complementary goods. So we can measure how responsive a change in the quantity demanded of one good is to the price change of another good. Similarly, we can think about how the quantity supplied of one good may change in response to the price of another good, measuring our cross-price elasticity of supply. And we can also think about how the quantity demanded of a particular good changes in response to a change in income or wealth. And we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end of this video as well. So let's dive a little bit deeper now into what determines elasticity and what some examples of different measures of elasticity are. And so our own price elasticity of demand, remember how the quantity demanded of a good changes in response to a change in the price of that good, is going to be determined by the necessity of that good and whether there are any substitutes. So we will think that demand has a less elastic own price elasticity when that product is essential and has few substitutes. So a classic example of the past 4 years here is the EpiPen. That the EpiPen, which is a medical device needed in response to a allergic reaction, to tide you over some of the effects of that, such as a bee sting or perhaps a peanut allergy or something, where your body is going to over-respond to an external stimulus there, is going to respond less, the quantity demanded of that good is going to respond less to a change in price. So the EpiPen, I believe, is now $600 to buy, or at least it was in 2019. So how much did increasing the price from, let's say, $100 per EpiPen to $600, did that impact the quantity demanded of EpiPens? Probably not too much, because the people who really need those absolutely have to have them. There are very few substitutes, and not having one would be a life or death situation if you were faced with an allergic reaction. So we would think that a change in price would bring about a relatively small change in quantity, which would make it less elastic or more inelastic, as we'll see on the next couple slides. So similarly, there is an own price elasticity of supply, which is going to be determined by the ability to expand production. So we'll think that supply has a less elastic own price elasticity when production cannot be changed instantaneously. So for example, if there are a large amount of tractors, agricultural equipment or farming tractors available for purchase at Steensma here in town. I know when I drive back to Ohio, there are a couple places where I drive by on some country roads which just have all kinds of probably close to $1 million tractors on their lots. So if the price that those tractor sellers are able to command for their agricultural machinery declines steeply and immediately, they are not going to be able to change how many tractors they have on stock on hand. That because these are such high margin, high profits pieces of equipment and goods that are bought relatively few times by an individual over the course of their life, then, or not at all if you're not a farmer, then there's going to be slower, longer turnover of this equipment on the lots of the salespeople. And they are not going to be able to really get rid of these tractors relatively quickly. And so the quantity supplied is going to be less responsive to a change in the price of those goods. And there may be other goods where a change in price is going to bring about an immediate change in the quantity supplied. And we may think of oil as being an example of this, that there are certain methods of oil production which are less profitable, and when the market price dips, they may still be produced, but they are now being held in storage. And so we saw a large amount of storage of oil back in the early part of 2020. I'm not sure if that's the best example of a good which there is a highly elastic supply for own price elasticity of supply, but it's just another example here to think about how responsive the quantity supplied is to a change in the price of that good. So just to restate what we covered on the previous slide, we would think that the slope of the demand or supply curves are said to be more elastic when there is greater relative change in quantity than in price. And the slope of the demand or supply curves are said to be less elastic, or again here, more inelastic, when there is a lesser relative change in quantity than in price. And we will see that graphically on the next slide. So in general, any point along the demand curve is going to have its own elasticity of demand. The elasticity of demand does change as the relationship between a relative change in price and a relative change in quantity changes. But it's going to be helpful to think about demand curves that are more elastic and that are less elastic. And so demand curves that are more elastic means that there is a greater responsiveness of the quantity demanded to a change in price. And so we can see that here on this graph, with this being a relatively flat or less steep demand curve, that if we have this initial equilibrium price being P0 and we decrease the price to P1, and let's say that P1 is this much below P0, and if we come over here and we see what the quantity demanded is at P1 and compare that quantity demanded at P1 being Q1 to the quantity demanded at P0 being Q0, then this difference is obviously much greater than this difference. So we think of a more elastic demand curve as representing a greater change in the quantity demanded in response to a smaller change in the price of that good. Now, while we're only looking here at demand and not at supply, the same lessons apply to the supply curve as well. And instead of looking at a more elastic demand curve, we're now going to look at a more inelastic demand curve, or a less elastic demand curve. And we're going to see basically the same relationship, just flipped now, so that a relatively small change in price, let's say price drops from P0 again to P1, and P1 is a certain distance below P0, then if we want to think how much the quantity demanded changes, we go over to the demand curve, we can see Q1. So whereas in the first situation on the previous slide, a small change in price brought about a large change in the quantity demanded, here a small change in price is going to bring about an even smaller change in the quantity demanded. And so when the quantity demanded is going to be less responsive to a change in the price of that good, we're going to say that it's less elastic. And this, once again, is representing situations where the good in question is a necessity and of which there are few substitutes, such as an EpiPen. Now, the last point that I want to make about elasticity in general before returning to it more in detail next week, is that if elasticity just means responsiveness, and we've already measured or illustrated what price elasticity looks like, what does wealth elasticity measure? So when we think of the wealth elasticity of demand, it means how responsive is the quantity demanded of a particular good to the wealth or income of the individual buying that good. And so whereas the own price elasticity is evident in the slope of the demand curve, we can't just look at a demand curve and make any inference about the wealth elasticity of that good. And importantly here, while own price elasticity must be negative, wealth elasticity can fall within different ranges. So if there is a positive relationship between wealth elasticity and the quantity demanded of a good, then we think of that as a normal good, meaning that this is really what most goods are, that if you become more wealthy, you are going to increase proportionally or more than proportionally your consumption of a particular good or service. So if we become wealthier, we now buy more, so I guess a luxury, not a luxury good, but a good which I buy more of the wealthier I am is duck breast. I love eating duck. And when I don't have as much disposable income, when I don't have as much wealth, I don't eat as much duck. I eat something cheaper, such as chicken or tilapia. But when my wealth or income would increase, then I would start to consume more duck breast or lobster, for example. Similarly, there are other goods where the wealthier you become, the less you consume. So the go-to example here of a good which has a negative relationship between your wealth or income and the quantity demanded is ramen noodles. We're not talking about like Momofuku ramen noodles in New York City or Chicago. We're talking about the little 50-cent paper styrofoam baskets, cups, dishes of ramen noodles that you can put boiling water in or put in a microwave or something like that. That when you have relatively little disposable income, this makes up a larger percentage of your budget. You are eating this more because it's cheap and it fills you up and it's satisfying. But the wealthier you become, the less of these cheap little ramen noodles you will choose to consume. And so we think of those as being inferior goods. Now, there are different types of normal goods. There are necessities and there are luxury goods. We're not going to get into that at this point in time. Just know that own price elasticity is always negative because of the law of demand. So the own price elasticity of demand is always negative because of the law of demand, that the more expensive a good becomes, the less of it you will consume. But the wealth elasticity of a good, of demand of a good, can either be positive or negative based on whether it's a normal good or an inferior good. So in the next video, we're going to return to our discussion of changes in supply and demand, but I wanted to get this video out there as a way for you to understand really the slope and the general shape and what we can learn about the slope and shape of demand and supply curves.